They said Mabel Graham was a diamond with no inclusions, flawless, cold, and utterly impenetrable. At 55, she was the industry's most feared master appraiser, a woman who could dismiss $1 million stone with a single bored sigh. I was the 32-year-old security consultant, hired to find the cracks in her fortress. The insurance board wanted a stress test of her vault, but I wasn't prepared for the stress test she would apply to my own composure. I thought I was there to audit a system. I didn't know I was walking into a collision that would shatter my professional distance and expose the terrifying reality beneath her icy surface. The Graham Institute was less an office and more a temple dedicated to silence and high-value carbon. Located in the sterile heart of London's financial district, the building hummed with the quiet, expensive sound of state-of-the-art air filtration. It smelled of ozone, old velvet, and the metallic tang of serious money. I walked in with the arrogance of my trade, carrying a tablet loaded with decryption software and a mandate from the insurance board to tear this place apart. They were nervous about the sheer concentration of wealth in one location. They wanted me to prove that Mabel's legendary instincts were no match for modern intrusion protocols. Basically, I was a paid intruder, an annoyance sent to harass a woman who regarded technology as a crutch for the talentless. I found her in the main appraisal lab, a cavernous room of reinforced glass and brushed steel. The lighting was calibrated to a punishing brightness, designed to expose every imperfection. Yet Mabel sat at the center station in absolute stillness. The first thing that struck me wasn't her reputation, but her posture. She was hunched over a microscope, her back a graceful, rigid line. Her hair was swept up in a severe, elegant chignon, the dark strands woven with unapologetic streaks of iron gray that caught the harsh light like silver wire. She held a pair of tweezers with a terrifying competence, her hands steady enough to defuse a bomb, or, in her case, judge the soul of a gemstone. "You're early," she said. Her voice was low, a textured contralto that vibrated in the quiet room. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. "I like to see the baseline before the variables change," I replied, setting my bag down. The sound echoed too loudly in the stillness. Mabel finally straightened. She turned slowly, the movement precise and deliberate, commanding the space without a word. Her eyes were amber, sharp and intelligent, framed by fine lines that spoke of experience rather than age. She looked at me with an unflinching gaze, assessing me with the same clinical detachment she had just applied to the stone. I felt the weight of it, a physical pressure on my chest. She wasn't looking at my security badge. She was reading the tension in my jaw, the way I held my ground. It was unnerving. Most people in her position were defensive, worried about their jobs. Mabel looked at me with a faint, almost bored amusement. "The board is panicked," she stated, standing up. She was taller than I expected, wearing a charcoal suit tailored to within an inch of its life. "They believe my reliance on the human eye is a vulnerability. You are here to replace my judgment with binary code." "I'm here to ensure your judgment is protected, Miss Graham," I said, fighting the urge to step back. "Security is about layers." "Mabel," she corrected, though it didn't sound like an invitation. It sounded like a dare. "If you are going to try to dismantle my life's work, you might as well use my name." She moved past me then, closing the distance between us. I caught the scent of her, sandalwood, cool air, and something sharper, like ink. It wasn't a soft scent. It was a statement. I watched her walk toward the vault, her movements efficient and fluid. She didn't believe I could touch her. She saw a 32-year-old technician playing with toys. But as I watched her key in the code, a spark of competitive heat flared in my chest. It wasn't just professional anymore. I wanted to prove her wrong. I wanted to find the one thing she hadn't accounted for, the one crack in her perfect facade that would force those amber eyes to widen. I didn't realize then that the vulnerability wasn't in the walls. It was standing right there, encased in charcoal wool and silence, waiting for someone brave enough to press the fault line. I decided to test the perimeter before I tested the vault. My software could crack a keypad, but social engineering is the bypass key that works on 90% of secure facilities. I needed to know if Mabel Graham could be fooled by a pretty face and a perfect lie. I hired Julian, an actor with the kind of desperate, aristocratic polish that usually signals old money in a tight spot. His prop was a high-end synthetic diamond, a lab-grown marvel chemically identical to the real thing, but created in weeks rather than cooked in the Earth's crust for eons. To a machine, it was flawless. To the naked eye, it was perfection. It was a trap designed to trigger her greed or her arrogance. I stationed myself in the security booth, the monitors bathing the small room in a cool, grainy blue light. The air here was stale, recycled, a sharp contrast to the expensive ozone scent of the main floor. On the screen, Mabel was a study in economy. She didn't offer Julian coffee. She didn't make small talk. She simply sat there, immobile, waiting for him to stop his rehearsed stammering about inheritance taxes and a grandmother's legacy. When he finally placed the velvet box in the desk, the silence that followed was heavy, amplified by the microphone feed. Julian opened the box. The stone glittered, aggressive and bright under the harsh appraisal lights. This was the moment she should have reached for the loupe. This was when she should have engaged the spectrometer or checked the refractive index. I leaned forward, watching for the tell, the widening of the eyes, the reach for a tool. She did neither. Mabel didn't even look at the stone closely. She simply extended a hand, her fingers long and deliberate, and touched the gem. She rolled it between her thumb and forefinger for 3 seconds. Just 3. "Take it back," she said. Her voice through the speakers was flat, bored. Julian blinked, his script failing him. "I beg your pardon? This is a VVS1. D-color—" "It has no temperature," Mabel interrupted, wiping her fingers on a silk cloth as if the stone had left a residue. "It feels room temperature. A real diamond stays cool. It holds a reserve of cold. And it lacks struggle. It's too smooth. It has the texture of something made, not born." She looked up then, and even on the grainy black and white monitor, her gaze was withering. "Tell whoever hired you that I don't appraise science experiments. And tell her that insults are expensive." Julian fled. He didn't just leave, he escaped. His confidence dismantled by a woman who hadn't even bothered to stand up. I felt the blood rush to my face, a mix of embarrassment and a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline. She had stripped the lie bare without a single instrument. It wasn't magic. It was an accumulation of sensory data so vast it looked like intuition. I walked out of the booth and back into the main lab. The atmosphere had shifted. The sterility was gone, replaced by a charged, thick tension. Mabel was waiting for me. She was leaning against her desk, arms crossed, the charcoal suit fabric pulling tight across her shoulders. She didn't look angry. She looked amused. "That was a waste of a good actor," she said, her voice dropping into that lower register that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "It was a standard blind test," I defended, though I felt like a student caught cheating. "You weren't supposed to know." "I didn't know," she corrected softly, pushing off the desk and taking a step toward me. The proximity was sudden. I could see the fine grain of her skin, the absolute precision of her eyeliner. I felt it. Synthetics are perfect. They have no history. I make my living on flaws, on the chaotic texture of the earth. She paused, her eyes locking onto mine, unflinching. "You think you can trick me with perfection, but perfection is boring. It's the inclusions that make things real." A silence settled between us, vibrating with unsaid challenges. It wasn't just about the diamond anymore. She was testing me, intellectually and viscerally. A spark of respect flared in her gaze. She liked that I had tried, even if I had failed. "Next time," I said, my voice steady despite the way my pulse hammered against my collar. "I won't use a proxy." "Good," Mabel replied, turning back to her microscope, but leaving the smile in her voice. "I prefer to handle the risks myself." The days settled into a rhythm that was deceptive in its calm. The Graham Institute was designed for silence. Thick carpets, acoustic paneling hidden behind mahogany, triple-pane glass that turned the chaos of London into a mute gray film. But silence isn't empty. It has a weight, a texture. Working in that shared space, the silence began to feel less like an absence of sound and more like a third person in the room, a chaperone that was slowly losing control of the situation. My station was set up in the corner, a glowing nest of monitors and server racks that hummed with a high-pitched digital whine. Mabel's domain was the center island, a shrine to analog precision. I spent hours just listening to the sounds of her work, The sharp, decisive click of tweezers against a metal tray, the soft scratch of a fountain pen — she refused to use a stylus — on heavy bond paper. The rustle of velvet as she unrolled a parcel of sapphires. It was an auditory landscape of competence. And beneath it all, the scent of the place, that dry, electric smell of ozone from the air scrubbers, mixed with the faint, dusty sweetness of old velvet. It was intoxicating. The proximity was becoming a problem. It wasn't just that we were in the same room. It was that the room felt too small for the sheer magnitude of her presence. I found myself watching her when I should have been coding. I watched the way the light from the microscope lamp caught the silver in her hair, turning the gray streaks into halos of platinum. I watched the way her glasses slid down the bridge of her nose and the absent-minded, elegant way she pushed them back up with a knuckle. There was a history in her movements, an economy of motion that comes only from decades of repetition. She was 55 years of practiced grace. I was 32 years of restless energy, trying to capture her ghost in a machine. One afternoon, the inevitable collision of our worlds happened over a simple file transfer. I needed the provenance documents for a rare emerald parure she was appraising. The server was down. My fault, a stress test gone wrong. So I had to ask for the physical folder. Mabel, I said, the name feeling less like a dare and more like a secret now. I need the Romanoff file. She didn't look up immediately. She finished her note, capped her pen with a deliberate snap, and then reached for the leather-bound folio on her desk. I walked over to take it. She held it out, not looking at me, her attention already drifting back to the microscope. I reached for the folder. My hand brushed hers. It wasn't a grab. It was a graze. The tips of my fingers sliding against the back of her hand. Her skin was cool, dry, like parchment or polished stone. Mine felt burning hot in comparison. The contact lasted less than a second, but the shock of it traveled up my arm and settled heavy in my stomach. It was the weight of it that surprised me. It felt significant, like dropping a stone into a deep well and waiting for the splash. Mabel froze. For a heartbeat, the pen stopped moving. The air in the room seemed to vanish, sucked out by the sudden vacuum of our awareness. Her hand remained still, but the tendons in her wrist tightened, a subtle roadmap of her reaction. The inclusions in this emerald are chaotic, she said suddenly, her voice tight, completely ignoring the electricity arcing between our hands. She was talking to the air, or maybe to the microscope, desperate to fill the silence with something safe. 3-phase inclusions, jagged, dangerous to the structural integrity. If you apply pressure to the wrong point, the whole thing shatters along the cleavage plane. She finally looked at me then, and the mask was back in place, but it was thinner. Her eyes were dark, dilated. She was using geology to describe us. She was warning me. She was telling me that she was fragile in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with how she was built. I'm good with pressure, I said, my voice dropping, matching her intensity. I didn't take the file yet. I let my fingers linger near hers, a millimeter of air separating us, charged with static. And I know how to handle fragile things. It's not about handling, she corrected, releasing the folder abruptly so it fell into my hands, breaking the circuit. She turned her back to me, adjusting the focus on her lens with aggressive precision. It's about knowing that some flaws are fatal. This stone has survived revolutions, theft, and 3 centuries of greed. It didn't survive by being open. It survived by being hard. I retreated to my corner with the file, my skin still tingling where we had touched. She could hide behind her refractive indices all she wanted, shielding herself with technical jargon. But I had felt the heat in her hand. I had seen the hesitation. The silence stretched between us, no longer awkward, but heavy with the terrifying promise of everything we hadn't said yet. The klaxon screamed. I scheduled the simulation for Tuesday, but knowing it was coming didn't prepare me for the physical reality. The blast doors slammed shut, vibrating in the soles of my shoes. The main lights died, replaced instantly by the low, amber bleed of emergency strips. The cavernous institute was reduced to a 10 by 10 steel box. The air recycling system kicked into high gear, a low, rhythmic thrum. We were trapped. Protocol dictated a 45-minute lockdown to cover the police response window. 45 minutes in a reinforced steel cube with the woman I was systematically trying to dismantle, forced to breathe the same recycled oxygen. Mabel stood with her back to the wall of safety deposit boxes. In the dim amber light, the gray streaks in her hair looked like spun copper. She wasn't moving. She wasn't checking her watch. She was vibrating. It was tension so high only a dog or a lover would hear it. I was standing less than 2 feet away. In this space, professional distance was a mathematical impossibility. I could feel the radiant heat of her body. I could smell that signature scent, sandalwood and cold air, intensified by the enclosed space and the rising temperature of our proximity. "You can sit," I offered, my voice sounding too loud in the acoustic dead zone. "The floor is clean." "I prefer to stand," she replied. Her voice was brittle, stripped of its usual velvet weight. She stared at the steel door as if she could melt it with will. "It's just a drill, Mabel. The sensor's tripped. The timer is running. We're safe." "Safe," she repeated, the word tasting bitter. She finally tore her eyes away from the door and looked at me. The shadows cut sharp angles across her face, aging her and then making her look impossibly young in the same flicker. "You think safety is a steel door. You think because you wrote the code, you control the outcome." "I do control it. I have the override key." "The last time I was in a room like this," she said, and the silence that followed was heavy, wet like wool. "It wasn't a drill. It was Zurich, 20 years ago. 3 men. They didn't care about the code. They cared about how much pain they had to inflict to get it." "I didn't know," I whispered. "You weren't supposed to," she said. She stepped closer, seeking the anchor of another living body. The space between us seemed to shrink, the recycling hum suddenly deafening. I could see the pulse beating frantically at the base of her throat, betraying the calm mask of her face. "You look for vulnerabilities in the system, Diana, but you forget that the system is built by people who are afraid." She didn't touch me. She didn't have to. She looked at me. It was an appraisal, slow and terrifyingly thorough. She traced the line of my jaw, the concern in my eyes, the way my hands were clenched at my sides to keep from reaching out. It was the same look she gave a diamond when she was deciding if it was worth the cut. She was assessing my structural integrity, asking silently if I was strong enough to hold the weight of her fear. For a moment, in that red-lit box, the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only the hum of the fan, the scent of sandalwood, and the terrifying realization that I wanted to be the wall she leaned against. Then the timer chimed. The lights flickered back to clinical white. The bolts retracted with a heavy thunk. The door swung open, spilling the sterile office air back into our sanctuary. Mabel straightened her jacket, the mask slamming back into place instantly. But as she walked out, she didn't look back. She didn't have to. We both knew the dynamic had shifted. The intruder was no longer outside the gate. Somehow, during those 45 minutes of darkness, I had ended up inside the keep. The conflict arrived late on a Thursday, disguised as a 5-carat Podparacha sapphire. It sat on the black velvet pad like a solidified drop of lotus blossom and sunset, a rare pink-orange collision of light that commanded the room. To the market, it was worth $3 million. To my security software, it was a lie. The office was deserted, the cleaning crews long gone, leaving only the hum of the servers and the tension radiating from Mabel's station. My algorithm had flagged the stone's trace element profile. The data suggested the color wasn't natural, that it had been induced by beryllium diffusion, a high-tech heat treatment that cooks the stone to enhance its beauty. If I was right, the gem was a fraud worth a fraction of the appraisal. If Mabel was right, it was a geological miracle. The software is never wrong about heavy metals, I insisted, tapping the screen where the red warning banners pulsed. The absorption spectrum is off. It's too clean, Mabel. Nature doesn't make this shade of orange without leaving a mess behind. Mabel didn't even look at my monitor. She was hunched over the main microscope, the fiber optic lights casting a harsh halo around her hands. "Your software reads data points," she said, her voice low and edged with exhaustion. "It doesn't read the struggle. It doesn't understand the memory of the stone." "Memory isn't a metric. Physics is. You're risking the Institute's reputation on a feeling." "Come here," she commanded. It wasn't a request. The authority in her tone pulled me across the room. I walked around the heavy mahogany desk, stepping into her pool of light. We were the only two living things in the building, and the silence suddenly felt conspiratorial. I stood next to her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her charcoal suit, close enough to smell the faint, sharp scent of ink and warm skin. "Look," she said, stepping aside but not moving away. I leaned in. My shoulder brushed hers. The contact was electric, a jolt that had nothing to do with static. It was the friction of two different worlds colliding, my binary certainty against her analog intuition. She didn't pull away. Instead, she reached out, her hand covering mine as I reached for the focus knob. Her skin was cool, her grip firm and deliberate. She guided my hand, adjusting the view with a terrifying gentleness. The weight of her hand on mine was a distraction, a heavy, sensory anchor that made my pulse jump in my throat. "Focus on the pavilion," she murmured, her voice right at my ear, vibrating down my spine. "Do you see the silk? The tiny, intersecting rutile needles?" I squinted through the lens. At first, I saw only the blinding orange light. Then, under her guidance, the chaos emerged. Tiny hairline fractures, microscopic clouds. "I see them," I whispered. "That's the inclusion. That's the flaw." "No," she said, and her fingers tightened slightly over mine. "That is the fingerprint. A heat-treated stone is clean, Diana. It's been cooked until the history is burned out of it. It becomes sterile. This chaos, it proves it grew in the earth. It proves it struggled to become what it is." I watched the tiny imperfections through the lens. The silk that scattered the light and gave the stone its velvety, sleepy glow. Under her guidance, the flaw became the feature. The imperfection was the only reason the stone had value. "Perfection is suspicious," she whispered, her breath ghosting against the sensitive skin of my neck. "We want things to be flawless because we think that makes them safe. We think if we can smooth out the rough edges, we can control the outcome. But the flaws are the only way to know something is real." I pulled back from the eyepiece, breathless. She was inches away. The amber light of the microscope reflected in her eyes, making them look like the sapphire's twin, complex, deep, and filled with a history I was only just beginning to read. We weren't talking about the stone anymore. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the gray steel in her hair, the rigid posture that held a lifetime of defense. I saw the inclusions of her character, the hardness she used to survive, the distance she kept to stay safe. My software would have rejected her. It would have flagged her age, her coldness, her walls as critical errors. "The software would throw this away," I said, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. "Then the software is blind," she countered. Her gaze dropped to my lips, then back up to my eyes, unflinching and heavy with intent. "It would destroy a fortune because it doesn't understand that the break is where the light gets in." The dispute died in my throat. I stood there, my hands still tingling from her touch, realizing that for the first time, I didn't want to fix the system. I didn't want to patch the vulnerability. I wanted to understand the flaw. I wanted to trace the silk in her defenses and find out if the heat beneath them was enough to burn me alive. And God help me, I was starting to hope it was. The sapphire went back into the vault, secured behind 3 layers of biometric locks. But the adrenaline didn't go back into the box. We ended up in her private office, a space that felt like a sanctuary, carved out of shadow and mahogany. It was usually forbidden territory, a place where the mask could slip, if only by degrees. Mabel unlocked the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a bottle of single malt that looked older than I was. She poured 2 glasses, neat. The sound of the crystal hitting the wood was the only noise in the building. "To the inclusions," she said, sliding the heavy glass across the desk toward me. It was a peace offering, or maybe a surrender. I took a sip. It burned, a clean, smoky heat that matched the atmosphere in the room. Mabel loosened the silk scarf at her neck, a tiny gesture of dismantling that felt momentous. She leaned back in her leather chair, the formidable posture softening just enough to reveal the fatigue beneath the armor. The master appraiser was tired. "You are dangerous, Diana," she said quietly, swirling the whiskey. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the reflection of the room in the dark liquid. "Not because of your software, but because you refuse to accept the boundaries of things." "Boundaries are just suggestions," I countered, leaning against the edge of her desk. "For you, perhaps. You are 32. You are fluid. You are still becoming. She looked up then, her eyes dark and unreadable in the low lamplight. I am 55. I am set. Like that stone, the heat and pressure have already done their work. I am what I am. There is no more room for shifting without breaking. You look at me and see a challenge. I look at you and see a force that could shatter everything I've cemented into place. You talk about yourself like you're a fossil, I said, the boldness of the whiskey hitting my tongue. You aren't rigid, Mabel. You're just guarded. There's a difference between stone and a fortress. One doesn't feel anything. The other feels everything and is terrified of letting it show. She went silent. Her hand, the one holding the glass, trembled slightly. It was a micro-tremor, the kind I'd seen when she thought no one was watching. She set the glass down with a sharp click and rubbed her left wrist with her right thumb, a rhythmic, unconscious soothing of an old ache. The arthritis. The price of 40 years of handling cold stones and holding absolute stillness under microscopes. I didn't think. I moved. I reached out and covered her hand with mine. She stopped rubbing, her hand freezing under mine. My thumb traced the tendon in her wrist, feeling the tension there, the tightness of a woman who held the world at arm's length. Her skin was warm now, the earlier coolness replaced by the flush of the whiskey and the argument. I can feel your pulse, I whispered. It was racing. Beneath that tailored charcoal suit, beneath the legend of the Ice Queen, her heart was hammering against her skin like a trapped bird. It betrayed every word of indifference she had ever spoken. Mabel looked at my hand on her wrist, then up at my face. The quiet in the room shifted, losing its professional edge. It wasn't the intellectual spark of the diamond test or the physical closeness of the vault. This was intimate. This was the moment the professional line didn't just blur, it vanished entirely. You shouldn't be touching me, she murmured, her voice rough, stripped of its polish. But she turned her hand over, palm up, her fingers curling slightly to graze my wrist. Tell me to stop, I challenged softly. She didn't. She just breathed, a shaky inhale that rattled in the quiet room. The danger wasn't about the insurance board anymore. It wasn't about losing her job or my contract. It was the terrifying realization that the fault line ran right through the center of the room, and we were both standing on the edge, looking down into the heat, waiting for the ground to finally open up. The gala was a different kind of vault, loud, bright, and filled with people who valued sparkle over substance. The grand ballroom of the Savoy was a sea of black ties and aggressive sequins, the air heavy with the cloying scent of lilies and expensive desperation. I was there ostensibly as part of the security detail, a shadow on the perimeter of the light. But I wasn't watching the exits. I was watching her. Mabel Graham did not wear ball gowns. She wore a column of midnight blue velvet that swallowed the light, high-necked and long-sleeved, severe enough to be a habit, but cut to cling to the long, elegant line of her back. For the first time, her hair was loose. It fell in a heavy silver-dark curtain around her shoulders, softening the sharp angles of her face in a way that felt like a private revelation made public. She looked regal, untouchable, and utterly furious. They were honoring her. A Lifetime Achievement Award, the kind of plaque the industry gives you when they think you are done, when they want to mount you on the wall like a trophy head. I watched the sharks circle her, investors with capped teeth, rival appraisers with hungry eyes, young upstarts trying to glean a scrap of her credibility by standing in her orbit. A young man in a tuxedo placed a hand on her velvet-clad elbow. I saw her flinch, a microscopic tightening of the jaw that no one else would have noticed. But I noticed. A cold, sharp spike of possessiveness drove itself into my chest, twisting like a knife. I wanted to cross the room and break his fingers. It was irrational and terrifyingly real. They saw the legend. They saw the Ice Queen of the Graham Institute. They didn't know how her pulse fluttered under a thumb. They didn't know the weight of her silence in a locked room, or the way she looked when she was talking about the flaws in a sapphire. I hated them for looking at her, and I hated her for letting them. I realized then that I had stopped being her auditor weeks ago. I was her guard dog, bristling at the gate. She found me. She always saw everything. She cut through the crowd with the same ruthless precision she used to navigate a cleavage plane, leaving a wake of stunned admirers behind her. She didn't smile when she reached my corner of the shadow. She looked relieved. "You're hiding," she said, her voice a low rumble under the frantic jazz of the band. She held a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. The bubbles were dead. "I'm observing," I replied, keeping my hands clasped behind my back. "It's what I'm paid for." "Then observe this," she murmured, stepping into my personal space, turning her back to the room so only I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "I am bored to the point of violence. It's a wake for my career while I'm still alive to hear the eulogies. I hate the noise. It lacks precision." She looked up at me then, her gaze stripping away the tuxedo, the crowd, the pretense. "I prefer the quiet of the vault, or the silence of my office. It's your party, Mabel. It's a performance, and I have forgotten my lines." She took a breath, and I smelled it. The sandalwood, the velvet, the heat of her skin rising above the scent of the lilies. "Get me out of here." It wasn't a plea. It was a command. It was a choice. We left before dessert. The valet brought her car, a vintage Jaguar, sleek and temperamental. I drove. She sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the rain-slick streets of London, the streetlights washing over her face in rhythmic intervals of amber and shadow. We didn't go to her house. We didn't speak. The silence in the car wasn't the comfortable quiet of the office. The distance between us vibrated with the tension of the drive. She wasn't looking at the road. She was watching her own reflection in the dark glass, watching the woman she had been for 55 years dissolve into someone else. The Jaguar purred, a low growl that matched the storm inside the cabin. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. I was driving her away from the safety of her public persona and back into the danger zone of our private reality. We were hurtling toward the Institute, back to the only place where the rules didn't apply. The air in the car was so charged, I felt like a single spark would ignite the upholstery. We were done with professional distance. We were done with the dance. We were driving straight into the collision, and neither of us hit the brakes. The door to her private office clicked shut, sealing us inside the hum of the ventilation system. The drive had been a vacuum, but this was the pressure chamber. Mabel didn't turn on the overheads. She moved to her desk by the light of the street lamps, filtering through the blinds, casting stripes of shadow across the midnight velvet of her dress. She looked out of place here now. The severe, sterile lines of the office rejected the softness of the velvet, just as her reputation rejected the woman standing before me, trembling in the dark. She stood by the window, her reflection a ghost in the glass. She looked at her hands, then at me. "You should go," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of the command she had wielded at the gala. It was a fracture. "The night is over. The performance is done. You've seen the cracks, Diana. There's nothing left to audit." "I'm not auditing you, Mabel," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I took a step forward, then another. The distance between us was a physical thing I had to dismantle. "And I'm not leaving." She turned then, her movements sharp, defensive. "Why?" The word was a plea wrapped in a challenge. "Why are you still here? You have the data. You won the argument. You proved the system is flawed. What more do you want?" I stopped inches from her. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, a stark contrast to the cool air of the room. I could smell the sandalwood and the fading scent of lilies from the ballroom. I looked at her, the silver in her hair, the terrifying intelligence in her eyes, the mouth that had spent a lifetime pronouncing judgments on cold, hard things. "Because you want me to be," I whispered. The silence that followed was absolute. Mabel let out a breath that sounded like a sob. Her defiance crumbled, not into weakness, but into a raw, terrifying need. Her breath hitched, a small, broken sound. So I moved. I reached out and cupped her face. Her skin was incredibly soft, a shocking contrast to the steel of her reputation. She leaned into my touch, her eyes closing, her guard dropping completely. When I kissed her, it wasn't frantic. It wasn't a collision. It was an appraisal. It was slow, deliberate, and unflinching. I tasted the dry champagne from the gala and the smoke of the whiskey she'd had earlier, but mostly I tasted the years of restraint she was finally letting go. It was a kiss of absolute precision, a study of texture and intent that demanded everything from both of us. I felt the precise moment she stopped thinking and started feeling. Her hands, those hands that could weigh a carat to the microgram, came up to grip my shoulders, their fingers digging hard into the fabric of my jacket, pulling me in with a desperate strength that surprised me. The kiss deepened, becoming heavy, weighted with months of silence and professional distance. It was the release of 45 minutes in a locked vault, of arguments over sapphire inclusions, of every stolen glance across a server rack. It was a conversation we had been having in code for weeks, finally spoken aloud. She pulled back, just an inch, her forehead resting against mine. Her breathing was ragged. "I am terrified," she admitted, the words vibrating against my skin. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be unpolished." "Then don't be," I murmured, my hand sliding down the velvet of her arms to hold her waist, anchoring her. "Be real. Be the flaw. Be the heat, Mabel." I kissed her again, and this time she didn't just accept it. She met it. She made a sound low in her throat, a surrender that shattered the last of the ice. There were no more walls. There was only the heavy, sensual pressure of her body against mine, the scent of sandalwood filling my lungs, and the terrifying, beautiful realization that the woman who knew the value of everything had finally realized she was the one being treasured. The sun came up like an interrogation lamp. It flooded the Graham Institute, bouncing off the reinforced glass and polished steel, exposing every dust mote and every decision made in the dark. The velvet shadows of the night before evaporated, leaving us with the stark, fluorescent reality of 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. The audit was due at noon. The fantasy was over. The logistics were beginning. Mabel was already behind her desk. She had smoothed her hair back into that severe chignon, though a few stray silver strands escaped, refusing to be tamed. She wore her glasses, reading a document she wasn't actually seeing. The distance was back. She had rebuilt the fortress overnight, brick by panicked brick. When I walked over with 2 paper cups of coffee from the cart outside, she looked at me like I was a subpoena. "This was a mistake," she said. Her voice was steady, but it lacked the texture of the night before. It was flat, compressed by fear. I let fatigue dictate my judgment. We have compromised the audit. We have compromised the Institute. "We just had coffee, Mabel," I lied, setting the cup down. "And we proved the security protocols are sound." "Don't," she snapped, finally looking up. Her eyes were rimmed with red. "Do not patronize me with technicalities. You know what the board will say. They are already looking for a reason to retire me. This is a gift to them. The aging spinster master appraiser seduces the naive young consultant. It is a cliché. It is pathetic. They will say I use my position. They will say I am desperate." "Let them say it," I said, refusing to retreat. "Since when do you care about the opinions of men who can't tell a ruby from a garnet?" "I care about my legacy," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "And I care about yours. You are 32. You have a reputation to build. Being attached to this, to a woman 23 years your senior who is being pushed out of her own company, it's professional suicide." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fear that she was a burden to my future, the terrifying vulnerability of a woman who had spent decades being the strongest person in the room. She was trying to protect me from herself. She was appraising our relationship with a jeweler's loupe and finding it far too risky to ensure. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed blue. I pulled up the final security report. It was a dense document, 50 pages of analysis on biometric lags and vault door hydraulics. "I'm submitting the report," I said. Mabel flinched. "Diana, it gives the Graham Institute a perfect score on physical security," I continued, typing the final authorization code. "The vault is impenetrable." But I added an addendum, a critical vulnerability note. I turned the laptop around. Under the section for personnel risk, I hadn't written a warning about compromise or theft. I had written a single sentence. "The primary asset requires constant, dedicated guarding due to high value and irreplaceable nature." "You taught me to value what is real," I said softly. "You taught me that the flaw is the fingerprint. The risk is the proof of life. This isn't a mistake, Mabel. It's the most honest thing in this building. I'm not auditing you anymore. I'm investing." She stared at the screen for a long time. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the heavy, fearful silence of the night before. It was the quiet of a decision being made. She reached out, her hand hovering over the keyboard, then moved past it to wrap her fingers around the warm paper cup. "It's terrible coffee," she noted, her voice trembling slightly. "It's the best I could find," I replied. "Next time," she said, looking up with a ghost of a smile, "we use the espresso machine. If we are going to be reckless, we should at least be caffeinated." I hit send on the report. The audit was officially finished. The secret was buried in the paperwork, and the real work of building a life was just starting. 6 months is a lifetime in the high-frequency trading of reputation. I established my own consultancy, Vantage, to avoid the conflict of interest that makes insurance boards sweat. But the real merger happened off the books. We created a new protocol, one that didn't rely on firewalls or silence. It relied on the terrifying, beautiful transparency of waking up together. It was a Sunday afternoon in her Kensington townhouse. The light was different here, softer than the lab, filtered through heavy linen curtains rather than reinforced glass. Mabel was reviewing a shipment of rough diamonds from Botswana. I was on the sofa, auditing a perimeter schematic for a gallery in Paris. The room was quiet, but it wasn't the sterile, pressurized silence of the Institute. It was a living silence, filled with the warmth of the Earl Grey sitting on the coaster and the rhythmic breathing of two people who no longer needed to defend their space. "This one has tension," Mabel murmured, holding a stone up to the afternoon sun. She wasn't wearing her suit. She was wearing a cashmere sweater that looked impossibly soft, the sleeves pushed up to reveal her wrists. I looked up. "The stone or the deal?" "The stone," she corrected, turning it over. "It's fighting the light. It wants to keep its secrets." I moved from the sofa to the floor beside her chair. It was a breach of protocol that would have been unthinkable half a year ago. I rested my arm on her knee. The contact was grounding. She didn't flinch. She didn't freeze. She simply dropped her hand from the stone to rest it in my hair, her fingers tangling in the strands with an absent-minded possession that still made my heart race. The sensation of her fingers against my scalp was better than any paycheck I had ever cashed. It was a claim. The industry was still talking, of course. They whispered in the auction houses and the boardrooms. They said Mabel Graham had lost her edge. They said she had been compromised by a pretty face and a midlife crisis. They said I was a climber, trading security codes for access to the inner sanctum. We heard the rumors. We drank them with our morning coffee and found them bitter, but ultimately harmless. They looked at us and saw a scandal. We looked at them and saw people who had never risked anything real. They couldn't understand that the algorithm of attraction doesn't care about birth years. "They're saying you've gone soft," I told her, leaning into her touch. Mabel smiled. It was a genuine expression, one that reached her eyes and softened the years of practiced severity. "Let them talk," she said, her voice low and rich. "Softness is a luxury. It takes strength to afford it. I spent 30 years being hard enough to survive. Now, I am interested in being pliable enough to feel." She handed me the diamond. It was rough, uncut, full of potential and danger. We inspected it together, her expertise guiding my eye, my perspective challenging her assumptions. The dynamic had shifted from master and intruder to partners. The age gap was still there, 23 years of history that she had, and I didn't. But it wasn't a wall anymore. It was a landscape we navigated together. She brought the map, I brought the compass. We were learning that precision in love is just as critical as precision in gemology. You have to know exactly where to apply the pressure. You have to know which flaws are fatal and which ones just make the light dance. Mabel wasn't the cold, inclusions-free diamond they thought she was. She was a living thing, full of heat and history. And I was the only one who knew the combination to the vault. Rarity is often confused with perfection, but true value lies in the courage to be real. Mabel Graham was never too cold for passion. She was simply preserving her warmth for someone brave enough to find it. If you have ever found a treasure where others only saw a risk, subscribe for more stories. And tell me in the comments, what flaw in your life turned out to be your greatest asset?